Thomas was not entirely at fault for this accident.
It smashed into the tower. As the tower crashed to the ground, bricks and dust exploded everywhere.
But make no mistake, he lit the match. In my Thomas Comes to Breakfast and Spotless Record videos, I argue that Thomas was unfairly blamed in both of those incidences when it wasn't really his fault. One commentator asked for my thought on this accident from The Great Discovery, hence this video. While I love Thomas himself, I will not say that he's innocent when the facts of the case clearly point to him being responsible for the accident. Take the crash from the beginning of Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure, for example.
Uh-oh! What have I done?
While the other accidents are arguable, this one was 100% Thomas's fault, and I can't reasonably say otherwise. As for The Great Discovery, why is this not entirely Thomas's fault? After all, Thomas was the one who gave Stanley a very heavy train. Let me explain. This is classic negligence law. Duty, breach, causation, damages. If you've ever taken torts, this case writes itself. Before we even talk about blame, we have to talk about responsibility. Because Thomas wasn't just another engine passing through that day, he was the one who decided who pulled what. On a railway, that matters. A lot. Trains aren't forgiving. When something goes wrong, there is no room for improvisation, only momentum. Thomas knew Stanley was new. He knew Stanley was eager, and he knew exactly how heavy that train was.
But Thomas knew it was too long and too heavy.
When you're the engine making those calls, you don't get to shrug and say, well, I didn't mean for this to happen. Your job is to think one step ahead, especially when the risk is obvious and the consequences are severe. So, from the very start, Thomas isn't just involved in this accident, he's responsible for how it was set in motion. Despite the fact that Stanley was in charge of the restoration of Great Waterton, Thomas was in charge of shunting the trucks and getting Stanley's train ready. Thomas wanted to prove himself worthy of being in charge, and he likely had that instinct when he was in charge before the first accident.
Thomas was puffing too fast round the bend. He toppled off the track. His load crashed down the bank.
Regardless, Thomas worked on the Northwestern Railway for years. He should have known, and in fact did know, what Stanley's limits were when he shunted a very heavy train for Stanley. Thomas made that decision to make the train unnecessarily heavy, hoping that Stanley wouldn't be able to pull them to show Stanley wasn't very strong. Thomas may try to argue that he had no intention of destroying the tower, he just wanted to make Stanley look incompetent. The law doesn't care that Thomas didn't specifically intend to destroy the tower. What matters is whether a reasonable engine in Thomas's position would have foreseen that overloading Stanley created an unreasonable risk of harm. Thomas wanted Stanley to fail. That was the whole point of this trick. But for Thomas wanting to play this trick, he would not have prepared a very heavy train for Stanley. The tower collapsed because Stanley's train smashed into it. Stanley's train smashed into the tower because the coupling snapped. The coupling snapped because of the crushing weight of the train. Finally, that train was heavy because Thomas made it that way. Every link in the chain of the accident happened because of Thomas. Even though Thomas didn't intend for the tower to collapse, overloading a train creates a foreseeable risk of mechanical failure and collision. Regardless of the specific outcome of the accident, Thomas had his share of accidents during his many years of working on the Northwestern Railway. An engine with decades of experience and many accidents should have known that a crash had the potential to happen, and the fact that he shunted those heavy trucks hoping for a negative disaster is proof that this accident was not only objectively foreseeable, but Thomas himself would have seen it coming. Finally, the consequences of this action were not just the surface level of the tower destroyed. All of the effort to rebuild this tower was lost because of the accident. On top of rebuilding costs, there are cleanup costs and expenses spent on repairing damage thanks to negligence, which are extra damages that a plaintiff can recover. Sir Topham Hatt is definitely in the right for his frustration with Thomas. In the heat of the moment, I do not blame him for not only being angry with Thomas, as Thomas himself is the most important factor in this accident happening. Yet, once the dust figuratively and literally settles, we need to look at the other important character in this scene, Stanley. Now this is where Thomas's defense can come into play. Stanley was a very strong engine. He was able to handle all of Thomas's other jobs at an equal or even greater level than Thomas himself was able to. Stanley might bring up that he didn't know that Thomas set him up to fail. While true, Stanley still could have prevented this accident, and he did not. Stanley knew that this train was very heavy.
Stanley chuffed back. My, that's a long train, he puffed.
And he knew that it would probably not be something he can handle. Yet, Stanley did it anyway. Stanley knew this train would be too much for him, and he chose to take it anyway. There were many things Stanley could have done to prevent this accident. He could have refused, asked for help, or even split the load. Instead, he just accepted that Thomas gave him a very heavy train, and he took said heavy train. So, because of that, a court would take all that point and split up the blame for the accident between Thomas and Stanley. In most comparative negligence jurisdictions, a jury would likely assign Thomas the majority of fault. However, in some jurisdictions, even a 1% fault from Stanley could bar recovery entirely. Thomas would ironically be overpunished in a court of law unless Stanley was given his share of the accident, but only enough as justice requires. Now, I turn to you, the YouTube jury. How much was Stanley at fault for this accident?